Welcome to 4C Radio. We're broadcasting from the central campus of Christ University, Bangalore. 4C Radio is brought to you by the Department of Media Studies of Christ University. For all who are looking for a platform that focuses on communities, commons, climate, and communication, this is the place to be. What's more, this station is run by a diverse community of students and dedicated faculty members. Tune in to experience hard-hitting interviews, fact checks, myth busting, on ground stories, campus news, and more. We recently observed National Press Day in collaboration with the network of women in media on our very own central campus. National Press Day falls on November 16th when the Press Council of India was constituted. To mark the occasion, we invited Ms. Kathy McLeish and Ms. Lakshmi Murthy to discuss an issue that rarely ever pops up in living room conversations, but is crucial to the functioning of healthy democracy and freedom of press. Need and relevance of support networks for journalists in today's times. And with India currently placed at 151 in global press freedom rankings, conversations like these feel less optional and more important. How could we not record a special for 4C Radio with Miss Kathy? In this episode of What's Behind the Story, Miss Prachi Pinglay speaks with Miss Kathy McLeish, a veteran journalist and senior producer with Australian Broadcasting Corporation, about a story that was tough to follow, that made impact, and is significant for everyone. Hi, Kathy. So nice to have you on our podcast. Our podcast section is called What's Behind the Story, where we talk to a journalist about any particular story that is close to their heart and how they went about it. So, shall we start?
We shall. Thank you, Prachi, and thanks for having me here.
Yes. So, what is the story that you want to talk about today? And how did you go about finding the story and covering the story?
So, probably one of the most significant stories for me was a story that I did on the closure of a mental health unit for young people, teenagers with severe and complex mental illness. So, it's quite rare, it's very serious, and it's extremely life-threatening. And one of the ways of managing these young people through this a number of years that they apparently then can grow out of or be kind of directed out of. But to keep them alive over that really significant period, they have a mental health unit that they live in where they're very tightly managed and treated. We got a very conservative government came in Queensland with a plan to cut costs wherever they could. They were making decisions very quickly, and it seemed to be a point of honour that they were making the decisions very quickly. But I think also it didn't give anybody an opportunity to, interrogate what the impact of that was going to be or protest it. So amongst all of that cost cutting, this centre was axed. There was discussion that it would be replaced with something else that was going to be better, that there would be other facilities to keep these children safe and keep treating these young people, and they didn't materialise on time. So they were working on them, but they didn't materialise. And the young people were just left into the community, their parents trying to cope. We heard that there had been a couple of deaths and that the parents were fighting for something. But there was a lot of fear. This new government had brought in gag orders, so any organisations that received government funds would lose their funds if they spoke to media. There was a lot of, punitive action taken against people, and these are parents of very sick children who are reliant on the government to provide services. So there was a lot of fear. We heard that 2 young people had taken their own lives. The parents were scared to speak and concerned about. And then one day there was another death, and the mother of that teenage girl said that she wanted to speak to the media. And so I had been already having discussions with the people around this story. It had come from actually years of mental health reporting. So it was it came out of that trust that you build over time with Around. And so one thing had led to another because I'd done a story somewhere else. I knew people there. I heard about the issues that were going on with this, and that connected me. So, really, that was a huge part of being able to get that story, was that trust that I had built up within that network. and within that mental health sector as a journalist and for, sort of reporting responsibly in the area. We heard that there'd been a report about and meetings around what they should do to replace this mental health unit, but it had been buried and the families had tried to get their hands on it and couldn't access it and couldn't find out what had happened. So we used the right to information laws in Queensland and Australia to go after this information. We were able to get this report. And when we got the report, we actually got a copy of the report that was in the meeting, and very senior executives had handwritten notes on the report changing your recommendations so that it better fit the scenario and the narrative of how it could be managed. So that was the key, really.
How long did it take for you from the time you heard that something was not right till the time you published the story?
I think would have been a matter of months in total, maybe 4 or 5 months. I think it took us weeks to get the report, and we got better and better at that. We were getting more information, so we were starting to really get better at targeting the reports we were going after. So what started to happen was that the government was starting to respond to our effort, to what we were doing. They knew we were getting reports and going after reports. They had brought in a new law that if you got a document under the right to information rules, it had to be published within a day. So we were under pressure to act quickly. So yeah, and also they could then publish. So we had to kind of get ahead of them as well. So it was, once it started to happen, it happened very quickly, it puts a lot of pressure when you're doing an investigative piece because you need to get it right. You need to make sure you have your facts and be in a very strong position not to get in any trouble or find yourself with a defamation or be undermined, really, for somebody to be able to pick up an error, a simple error that undermines all the great work you've done.
Were there any particular instances or days or any moments where you felt this was not working out or this won't happen?
Yes, there were definitely, in the early days, there were a lot of walls around us, a lot of brick walls, and we wondered if we'd be able to get through them and how we would get through them. We heard that there was this report. So gradually you're pulling threads and slowly things are opening up. As I say, once it started to roll, it really started to roll. And then the government started to respond. So, we're kind
there
of
was an impact.
responding to what we were doing, to our reporting. And that gave us, then we went after other reports. So we went after minutes of the meetings they were having with the parents, and we were exposing the cover-ups as well. So they were trying to cover up what they'd done. So that was something I learned from the freedom of information person that I worked with, a senior person that kind of stepped in to give us a hand, was that, really start RTIing your own stories as well and see how they responded to it, because often they're kind of, adds another layer and exposes other things.
Correct. Every time I have covered, especially farmers' distress or, where you're meeting people who have lost a member of their family, and when you're writing about it, it's just a couple of lines, but spending time with that family or meeting those people does a lot more to you than what you have written or what you have published. How was meeting them? What was your experience? Because it must have been, traumatic is probably not the best word, but how was it for you to meet these families?
Yeah. I think traumatic is a good word. It's vicarious trauma, and we really need to protect ourselves and be aware of it and, take care of ourselves. So I met the mother of the 16-year-old girl who took her own life the next day. And so it was very raw. She was, quite shocked. It was quite shocking to us too, to go there. And it was, and to have been working on the story and then have this happen. And you feel an enormous responsibility as well for that person. Should they be making the decision to do a public interview when they're in this state? And also you're there with them, and you have to be open and empathetic to hear the story and understand it and feel it and then tell it. But you also need to be very mindful that you can't carry all that. It's too much. And I know journalists who have had, really severe PTSD problems from vicarious trauma. It's a really real thing for journalists. I've found that a way to kind of create a distance that is a bit protective but still be there, is to really think, the best thing I can do for you is tell your story in the very best way I can. Tell it as factually and as powerfully as I can. If I climb in the hole with you, I'm not helping you. So that kind of helped, have my head in the right space to care about what's happening, but not, try and protect myself as well.
If I may ask, what was the impact of this story? Like,
What massive. So I did an interview with the executive director, who was actually the man who who put his initials on it. And it went for 45 minutes, this interview, and he was just not really giving anything. And then suddenly, I don't know why it suddenly happened, but he said, well, we had we had other beds. We had created these other beds. And I said, why weren't they in them? And he looked straight at the camera and he said, we failed them. And so that went in the story. When I got this, my editor said to me, what happened? And I said, I think he said, and we had to watch it again. I couldn't really believe what had been said. So that went in the story. We had the report, we had the parents, we had everything. Whereas at the beginning we had nothing, you were thinking, well, we need to cover this. We've got no case study. We've got nobody speaking. And so he lost his job. The minister that oversaw it he had to stand down, and he never recovered in terms of being a minister again. So there were ramifications. And then the day that they announced the $60 million overhaul and the news centre, and the government contacted my newsroom and gave us a heads up, and I went down for it. And the health minister shook my hand and said, congratulations. So it was huge. Yeah. So that's why that's my favourite story. It was fantastic. And I'm still friends with that mother.
and in given today's times, I think it's only getting worse by the day in terms of various mental health pressures that the young generation is coping with. Do you feel that more needs to be done, or does it need to be done differently? How do you look at the media coverage around severe mental health issues and youth?
Yeah, I think it's quite complex. I think that you really need you do need those rounds people, or somebody that, it builds up that trust in the space to really be able to tell those stories. I don't think I think it's like a lot of issues that really need more coverage, that sometimes they're really difficult ones to cover, and they don't get told as often as they should.
When you were telling me this, I was thinking of the latest case about when the ChatGPT encouraged a young teen to take his own life. He was chatting with ChatGPT about his own trauma, and now there's a legal case. And I'm just thinking, oh my God, this is...
Yeah.
And
I think that's the thing. It's a very difficult space in terms of particularly, young people, parents don't, and you don't want young people branded either. It's not always permanent. It's often something they can be treated for. And so it's tricky. It's a tricky space.
in terms of takeaway, we have a lot of young students who want to become journalists, and they're also young, so they are also facing all of these pressures, if I may say so. What would be your advice or suggestion in terms of looking at the coverage that happens on mental health and actually doing the coverage when they step out? Because they're going to finish their courses in a couple of months, and then they're going to go out, and maybe some of them will report on these issues.
I think be empathetic, be genuine. If you say that you're going to, cover this story, sort of, and be careful with it, really do that. Do what you say in terms of to the people that you're dealing with. And if there's going to be variation to that, be honest and open, and explain why you're going to do the coverage in a different way, or you need to take a different tack. I think you also do need to give them some power in that, which is slightly different to political reporting, or, sort of where you are going to report it in the way that you see it as a journalist. With mental health, I think if something changes for the person you're covering the story for, and they don't want the story told that way, or there's something they want left out, I think that's a conversation you need to have with them in a really open and honest way. And there will be times where you should step away, because there's a lot at risk for them, that's different for politicians who are used to the rough and tumble, for instance.
Right.
Yeah.
They're more vulnerable in some ways.
Yes, yeah, they are more vulnerable, and you need to, if you're in that space, you really need to understand that. And I think that's something about building up that credibility and, with that round as well. Sometimes you need to measure how important is it to tell the story, and is there another way to tell it without now using this case study, or, sometimes you have to let go.
Also to understand what could be the repercussions of that story on that family in some way.
It's a big responsibility, and sometimes, depending on the circumstances, sometimes it's right to just go in and report the story and then move on. In some cases, you do wonder. I think the other thing is just to be frank with people as well, that, and often if you ask them, are you concerned about the risk, what's going to happen to you after the story goes, they will have, of course, thought of that, and they've decided to take on that, that on,
Right.
which helps you, to know that.
Anything else that you would like to mention?
So I think as a journalist, really follow your passions, care about people and their stories, tell the stories as best you can. If things need to change, if somebody needs to be held accountable, if power needs to be held to account, be courageous.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that was Miss Kathy McLeish, a journalist whose work did not stop at exposing a problem. It led to a state inquiry and complete restructuring of Queensland youth mental health services. That kind of impact comes from careful work, persistence, and a refusal to look away when something is clearly wrong. That's all for today's episode. Hope it made you think about support for mental health and empathize with those who struggle. We will be back with more next week. Until then, as always, stay curious and question everything. This interview was done by Ms. Prachi Pinglay. This podcast was illustrated by Ms. Vernika Singh, edited by Aditya Srinivas, and is hosted by Steffi Christina. So follow us, subscribe, and share widely.